last time you saw the red gum table, things didn't exactly go to plan. The epoxy pour was supposed to be one of the defining features of the build, but Winter had other ideas. The temperature in my workshop was simply too cold, and trying to control the conditions around a large epoxy pour was becoming more difficult than the pour itself. I needed somewhere smaller, somewhere I could control the temperature, keep the dust out, and work with epoxy without having to heat an entire workshop. And that problem planted the seed for a completely new project, the Samurai Pod. Next door to my workshop is my dad's shed, and at the far end of it is a roughly 6 by 3 metre bay. It wasn't exactly ready for construction. Over the years, both Dad and I had slowly filled it with timber, old materials, tools, and all other things that get pushed somewhere because we might need them one day. If I was going to turn this forgotten corner of the shed into a purpose-built finishing space, all of it had to go. So before I could build the Samurai Pod, I had to find the floor. Clearing the bay turned into a bit of an archaeological dig. Buried amongst everything were stacks of pallet bearers and slats that I'd collected over time. Whenever I broke down a decent pallet, I could never quite bring myself to throw the timber away. I knew I'd eventually find a use for it. The problem was, until now, I hadn't. And as I started pulling it all out of the shed, another idea began to take shape. Instead of simply clearing this space and then buying a pile of new timber to build the pod, why not use what I already had? The pallet timber wasn't perfect. It was rough, mismatched, full of nail holes and years of abuse. But for a prototype, that didn't really matter. In fact, it almost made more sense. This first Samurai Pod didn't need to be perfect. It needed to prove that the idea worked. A small enclosed space where I could control the temperature, keep the environment more stable, and finally have somewhere suitable for curing epoxy pours through a Melbourne winter. So suddenly, all that timber I'd been hoarding wasn't just junk anymore. It was the beginning of the foundation. With the bay becoming more cleared, I could start thinking about what the pod was actually going to sit on. The shed still had a dirt floor, so I didn't want the timber structure sitting directly on the ground. I needed something simple, solid and cheap. So rather than buying precast blocks, I decided to begin making my own. I knocked together a basic reusable form from scrap material and started casting a series of small concrete supports. Nothing particularly sophisticated. But these blocks would give me solid points to support the floor structure and help keep the timber away from the ground. One of the problems with Dad's shed was exactly what I just spent all that time cleaning up. There wasn't really anywhere organised to put anything. So some of these blocks would eventually support a storage rack along the shed wall as well. If I was going to steal one of Dad's bays for the Samurai Pod, I figured the least I could do was give him some storage back. Once the forms were made, it was just a matter of mixing, pouring, and waiting for concrete to do what concrete does. Welcome back to another episode of Samurai Joinery. Today, I'm putting the red gum table on hold for a little while. just while I wait to figure out a solution to get the temperature right for the epoxy pour. I plan on adding a Japanese shoji pattern to the table, and I came up with the idea of doing an epoxy pour and having 10mm deep inlays with a contrasting colour. So at the moment we're in the middle of winter in Melbourne. There's no easy way of doing an epoxy pour and getting things cured in the near future. For some reason, the first thing my brain wanted to figure out wasn't actually the floor, it was the walls. I knew from the beginning that I wanted the entire pod to be modular. Something I could build in sections, bolt together, pull apart again if needed to, and potentially improve as the idea developed. So naturally, I started building a wall before I'd even built the floor. I needed some decent lengths of timber to get me up to the full wall height, so I started going through the pine I had left over from previous jobs and machining whatever I could reuse. And because this was eventually going to become a temperature controlled space, I also needed to think about insulation. I decided to use 25mm foil board, but rather than simply fixing it onto the back of the frame, I wanted it to sit neatly within it. So I cut rebates into the framework, giving the insulation a proper recess to locate into. It added another step to every piece, but it meant the wall could stay relatively thin, while still giving me an insulated, self-contained module. At this stage, I didn't have a floor, but at least I knew how I wanted to build a wall. Once I'd finished the first wall module, the idea for the floor started becoming a lot clearer. If the walls were going to be modular, it made sense for the floor to work the same way. I didn't want to build one huge platform that would be difficult to move, difficult to store, and almost impossible to relocate once it was assembled. So instead, I broke the floor down into a series of smaller modules. The idea was simple. Each section could be built separately, carried into position, bolted to the next one, and then pulled apart again if the pod ever needed to be moved or reconfigured. For the frames, I machined 70 by 35mm timber, using the pallet bearers that I had acquired from the junk pile earlier, with small joists spaced at roughly 300mm centres to keep everything stiff and well supported. Once all the modules were joined together, they would form one complete floor structure. And eventually 2 layers of 12mm OSB would be fixed over the top to tie the whole thing together. So with the basic system worked out, I started building the floor one module at a time. floor modules were assembled in the background, it was finally time to start preparing the space they were actually going to sit on. The existing floor in Dad's shed was just dirt, and after a few years of use, it was anything but flat. So I had a load of crushed rock delivered and spread it across the bay to give me a much more stable base to work from. From there, it was a matter of levelling it out, tamping everything down, checking it again, and then levelling it some more. Originally, I'd planned to use the concrete blocks I'd made earlier as the supports for the pod. But as luck would have it, we already had a stack of suitable concrete blocks sitting at the back. So rather than making more work for myself, I decided to use those instead. The blocks I'd already cast wouldn't go to waste. They'll eventually be used for the storage racking along the shed wall, and I'll keep some aside for when the pod eventually gets moved to a more permanent location. Because even though this first prototype is being built inside Dad's shed, the long-term idea is for the Samurai pod to eventually stand on its own outside. For now though, I just needed a flat, solid foundation, and somewhere to start putting all these modules together. There's a Japanese proverb that fits this project perfectly. Iso gaba mawere. It means, if you are in a hurry, take the long way around. And I think that applies to almost every part of this build. The temptation is always to rush towards the finished result. But with something like the Samurai pod, the accuracy and the end depends on the preparation at the beginning. Getting the ground level, getting the foundations right, getting every module square, because taking a little more time now usually saves a lot more time later. With all the floor modules finally built, I could start laying everything out and getting the whole base level. This was one of those jobs where rushing really wasn't going to help. Even though the crushed rock had been levelled and compacted, there were still slight variations from block to block. So I treated it the same way I would a cabinet installation. I found the low spots and used plastic packers to bring each module up until everything sat level and supported. For this temporary assembly, I'll screw the packers to the underside of the floor frames, so they stay with each module if I need to pull the pod apart again. When the Samurai pod eventually moves to its permanent location, I can revisit the foundation properly. But for now, the goal was simple: get every module sitting solid, level, and ready to bolt together. And with that, the first major stage of the Samurai pod was finally starting to come together. All of the floor modules were in position, packed, levelled, and sitting where they needed to be. It had taken a lot more preparation than simply throwing a floor down, but getting this foundation right now should make everything that comes after it much easier. In the next episode, I'll pull the modules back apart, seal and protect the undersides, then bolt the entire floor system together properly. And from there, the Samurai pod can finally start going up. If you've enjoyed following the build so far, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more Samurai joinery. There's plenty more to come.